A warm welcome once again to all. I also want to take a moment to introduce some of our team members who've been joining us today. So many thanks to Becca and Ronja for being here and supporting the webinar series and the work on sustainable transport. And our speakers today are my colleagues Michael Capetanakis and Eduardo Carlucci. Both have been working over the past few years on economic and financial models of transport projects, and will be presenting to you some of the work. Today's agenda will be all about learning about systems thinking and tools embedded in system dynamics modeling. We'll also learn more about how these methods help to understand the outcomes of transport policies and investments. Michael will give you a deep dive, for some of you who were here last week, into a tool called causal loop diagrams, which is the first step of the sustainable asset valuation methodology and the first step for creating a broader understanding of the wider impacts of sustainable transport infrastructure investments. And then finally, we'll also take a deeper dive in how models can quantify the social, economic, and environmental impacts of the transport investments. And we'll do that throughout this webinar by using the case study example of the BRT in Bandung, Indonesia. Now, before we kick this off, I'd like to jump to a very short Mentimeter slides where we'd like to hear who's here with us today, because I see many new names who were not here last week, and we'd really like to hear from you who you are, where you work, in what sector you're working, as well as what you're curious about and what you're hoping to learn today, or perhaps also on Thursday when we have the third webinar of this series. So I'd like to ask you to take a moment to just fill out those short 2 questions. My colleague Becca has just posted the link to the Mentimeter in the chat. Thank you. So just click on that one or scan the QR code and let us know who's here and what you're curious about. And I won't be sharing my screen at this stage to show you the results, but I can tell you that we have a quite mixed audience. We have representatives from the public sector, especially local government, as well as other civil society organizations here in the room. So that's great to have that mix. And it seems that today's interest lies with hearing more about the case study of the BRT, the use of the sustainable asset valuation methodology in infrastructure development in urban contexts. So this is certainly something we're addressing throughout the series. And there's also the request to know more about the tools for implementing systems thinking in infrastructure investment and development. So that's excellent, and really hoping to meet some of these expectations, of course, throughout the webinar today and on Thursday. Without further ado, let me hand it over to my colleague Michael. I think we can go to the next
So
slide.
hi everyone.
There we go.
Thank you
Michael,
very much.
over to you.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining today. So as Lisbeth mentioned, today we will talk about system thinking and system dynamics, and how we apply these approaches to sustainable transport assessments. So let's start with system thinking and kind of a theoretical foundation. Then we will go to system dynamics, and then I will present a an example of a causal loop diagram, which is a system dynamics model of a case study that will be presented in more detail at the last part of this session. So systems thinking, let's start with the definition. And basically the definition of system thinking says that system thinking is a discipline for seeing wholes. It is a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots. And today, system thinking is needed more than ever because we are overwhelmed by complexity. This complexity includes more information than anyone could absorb, greater interdependency than anyone can manage, and also accelerated change. Now, under systems thinking, an approach for developing models to promote our understanding starts with events, and the underlying patterns under events are the patterns of behavior resulting in these events. And even broader than this are the underlying structure responsible for these patterns of behavior. So I'll provide an example in the next slide, but systems thinking basically states that it is only through understanding the underlying structure that we can identify the most appropriate leverage points within the system to affect change. Here you can see how it works. So first we have the events, what's just happened. Underneath we have the patterns, what's been happening for a while. And under that, we have the systemic structures. So what are the forces at play contributing to these patterns? And then overarching all of these are the mental models. So what about our thinking and what it is allows the situation to persist? So at this point, let me provide an example. So let's take one event. A new road is constructed and there is a traffic jam and bad air quality as a result within an urban context. This is an event. A pattern is the use of cars and how the use of cars increases as roads are constructed. So a pattern is convenience. People think more roads mean shorter travel time. They shift from public transport or other modes to cars, but this does not solve the traffic problem. Sorry, in the long term, it makes it worse. So the system structure underneath this example is that policymakers think that more roads are good and are stuck in this kind of thinking. So they keep building roads to address a problem, which long term is not getting addressed, and they're stuck in this vicious cycle. So in a way, there is a lack of feedback perception. So let's continue here. Again, events, it's more about what happened, where, when, in what context, who was involved. Then the patterns, it's basically something that repeats itself, and kind of the patterns provide a richer a picture of reality and give more insight to the story. Underneath, as we mentioned, are the systemic structures, which show how factors interact with each other and produce observed patterns and events. And at the end, there are the mental models that basically state that how we as individuals understand and make sense of reality. So this is an important point because I will show you how a causal loop diagram that I will present later is kind of a mental model to understand a system. Now, let's talk about what systems thinking aims to address. First, it aims to address complex problems that often involve many actors and require everyone to see the bigger picture. It aims to address also recurring problems, aims to address also issues where an action affects or is affected by its surrounding environment, For example, this can be the natural environment, the economy, or society as large. And it also aims to address problems without obvious solutions. So complicated situations overall. How can we apply this systems thinking to sustainable transport? So socio-environmental systems, as we know, are complex. They involve many interdependent and highly interactive factors. And in order to understand these systems, we need to look at how these factors change over time. We need to consider feedback loops that we'll talk about when I present the causal loop diagram. Um, and overall, to fully understand and value the impacts in the case of transport and transport policies and investments, a systemic approach is required. So a systemic view basically enables the capturing of the multiple co-benefits of sustainable transportation. These co-benefits can be social, can be environmental, can be economic. And in general, it provides a more comprehensive assessment of the value for money for sustainable investments compared to unsustainable alternatives. So for those who joined the first session, here is a small reminder of basically how we apply system dynamics to different projects through our methodology, the sustainable asset valuation methodology. We start with a qualitative analysis, which is a systems mapping and the causal loop diagram. And then we move to the quantitative analysis, which can integrate many different, let's say, approaches or analysis, such as location-specific data, spatially explicit analysis, climate data and forecast as well, and secondary research and literature review. And then we go towards building a system dynamics model or an Excel-based model or both. And at the end product is our integrated cost-benefit analysis, which includes all of the different social, environmental, and economic impacts. So this is a theoretical kind of foundation under systems thinking. Let's move to system dynamics to see how it is applied more practically. So it's the more kind of more quantitatively. So first, let's make an important distinction. System thinking attempts to understand the whole system rather than solely its parts, and is linked to a qualitative or more theoretical approach, as I mentioned, whereas system dynamics is how we apply this thinking practically. So it is an integrated and quantitative or modeling approach, as I just showed in the Savvy slide. Used to understand different situations for complex issues and to guide decision-making towards sustainable long-term solutions. So again, while systems thinking helps us to qualitatively understand how a system works, system dynamics allows us to model the behavior of this system quantitatively, look at different impacts and what their value is. So in a way, it helps us estimate the extent to which socioeconomic and environmental drivers of change interact with one another in a system and shape future trends. And by doing that, it also determines the economic and societal viability of an infrastructure project. Now, this happens by adding data and equations to the analysis. So we try to look at much needed evidence. What are the basic outcomes of infrastructure investments, both for investors and society as a whole? And then we try to integrate all these in one model. So here a little bit more on the technical side. Again, this is linked to the causal loop diagram, the systems map that will show more in detail later. So system dynamics uses stocks that is a variable that accumulates, and flows, which represent a rate of change. So we include this through equations that are used to define relations among variables and how they change. These equations capture the non-linearities, delays, feedbacks, and other dynamics that define complex systems. So let's talk about the simulation of scenarios and how we develop different sensitivity analysis or scenarios within the models that we develop. So system dynamic models generate scenario based on the inputs or the data provided on the models. So what we do basically in a given sustainable transport assessment is that we develop what-if scenarios. Hence scenarios that enable the analysis of what happens if a specific decision is taken about transportation investments or policies. Again, I will present the examples in a few slides. Overall, this implies that the outcomes of a simulation are determined to a large extent by user-defined decision rules concerning the choice of infrastructure to be implemented. So usually the scenarios simulated do not optimize for a specific outcome, but rather allow for analyzing the systemic consequences of action. So we look at the direct, indirect, and induced impacts of a particular transport decision. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. When we say that these analyze the systemic consequences of an action, this means, again, that we don't only look at the direct impacts of the investment decisions, but also at indirect and induced long-term impacts. So let's look at one example, which is the non-motorized transport network in Coimbatore that I presented last week. So when we looked at the non-motorized transport network, the direct impacts are, of course, income creation from employment, so employment creation, are the health benefits from physical activity as more people walk or cycle, are the avoided carbon emissions because there is a shift from cars to NMT, and avoided fuel costs, for example. Now, let's look at indirect impacts that are not visible straight away, but that we try to also integrate in our analysis and identify and value. So in this case, the indirect impacts of the non-motorized transport network would be an increase in retail revenues as people are walking and cycling more. So research shows that they tend to buy more from retail establishments. So in a way, there is a revitalization of the local economy because of this project long term. Again, indirect impacts include increase in property prices. So if people cycle or walk more, there's going to be less air pollution, less noise. So over time, property prices will be increased. This is an indirect impact as well. Avoided cost of accidents, since more people are using bicycles or are walking rather than driving. And then we also have the induced impacts. So if more people are cycling and have increased physical activity, there is a reduction in respiratory diseases and related health costs overall. These costs are borne by the government, so long-term, this is a big benefit. So you can see a little bit how we try to integrate all these different impacts that are not just visible straight away, but they can be also long-term, indirect, and induced. So in our assessments, we simulate at least two scenarios. So one is the business as usual or BAU scenario, and one is a sustainable transport scenario. And then we can keep adding sensitivity analysis or different sustainable transport scenarios to see the difference on what is the difference in demand and so on. For example, we can see if demand for public transport is smaller or larger than what is expected or what was expected in the beginning, or if the shift from private vehicles to a public transport system, or NMT, as we showed in the example, is larger or smaller than what we expected. So in a way, we play around with these scenarios and we see what are the long-term impacts, but we always do have to have a baseline scenario, which considers a reality where a project or a policy doesn't happen. So things stay exactly as they are. So we talked about systems thinking. We talked about system dynamics and how it is applied quantitatively. And I think now it's a good time to move on to the causal loop diagrams, where I can show you a little bit how we approach a project, how we try to identify the different impacts and eventually quantify them. So again, the first part of this section is about causal loop diagrams, and we'll look at the basic elements of causal loop diagrams that include feedback loops, delays, and so on. Before we do that, we need to explain what is the main aim of causal loop diagrams, which are systems maps again. So what they try to capture is the hypothesis about the cause of dynamic in a system. This system can be a city, can be a region. They are also try to capture the mental models of individuals or teams, what we talked about before when we presented systems thinking, and also the important feedback loops driving the system. So kind of different dynamics that can be exponential or reaching an equilibrium within a city or a region. So critical aspects for creating the causal loop diagrams is thinking in terms of cause and effect between different impacts, focusing on feedback linkages among components of a system, and determining the appropriate boundaries for defining what should be included in a CLD. Again, CLDs are an explicit representation of the driving forces and dynamics underlying the behavior observed in the system of interest. Again, to mention that for every Savvy assessment, we always customize a causal loop diagram. We do that in collaboration with our stakeholders or our clients. And in order to, in a way, this process ensures the relevant indicators and dynamics and how they can be captured to help stakeholders and us to understand the complexity of a given system. So before I delve into the example, this is the BRT, the Bus Rapid Transit project in Bandung in Indonesia, a project that we recently worked on. And this case study will be presented in more detail. So we'll see all the results, all the indicators or the scenarios modeled right after the CLD. So let's start to see exactly what is meant by causal loop diagrams and systems thinking and system dynamics. So here we start with a first and a more simple relationship. So we have a demand for bus rapid transport means less demand for individual transport modes and vice versa. Now, in yellow, this relationship, we start with demand for bus rapid transit leads to higher capacity of BRT transports as more investment goes in and as more people are using the system, which will eventually lead to more roads dedicated to bus rapid transit within a city, for example. And this long-term can reduce congestion. So here, the relationship, the loop in pink, again, demand for bus rapid transit increases the investment and capacity of BRT, which reduces the use of individual transport modes, such as cars or motorcycles. And this can reduce congestion, time spent on transportation, and this in turn increases the demand for BRT transport. So let's look at another loop or relationship here in orange. Again, we start from the same starting point. Demand for BRT increases the capacity of BRT transport, which reduces the use of individual transport modes, such as cars. This reduces the use of fuel. And as a result of that, CO2 emissions and air pollution actually decrease over time, which in a given region, it increases labor force quality, productivity, and GDP. So this can result in more investment being provided for BRT infrastructure. So this is kind of a positive result, but it can also lead in a way, because there's more income available and more affordability because of the GDP benefits. It can lead to the increase of individual transport modes. So more affordability of individual transport modes, such as cars and motorcycles. So demand for these modes increase, which increase their use overall. So we try to basically model different scenarios. Some scenarios can be positive. In this case, investing in more BRT infrastructure will be a positive kind of result. But as more people have more money because of GDP benefits, they might also buy more use more individual transport modes. So here, some of these relationships, these are all the different kind of impacts and feedback loops that we included here. In red, you can see what I just mentioned, that GDP can increase investment in BRT infrastructure and increase BRT demand, but we also include many different direct, indirect, and induced relationships or impacts. In this case, you can see we have included impacts such as property values, accidents, how they have reduced or increased, we don't know, as a result of the BRT. What are the differences in retail revenues? What about the health benefits through additional distance walked, noise pollution, and so on? So more BRT transport increases employment from BRT, which increases total employment in transport, which has significant GDP benefits in this case. So we can see that overall, one of the key advantages of Savvy and these causal loop diagrams is that it allows us to see a system as a complex and integrated entity. So we look at how key performance indicators, as you can see in the CLD, and outcomes interact with each other. And we do not assess them in isolation, but always in combination in order to understand how a system works in every context. These are different in every context. So we try to get access to local data to understand that all of these results, all of these relationships are different in different cities, in different regions, and in different countries. And I will stop there. In case you have any questions, I'm sure you might have a lot. And then later, my colleague Eduardo will present this BRT case study in more detail in case you have any more questions. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for presenting the causal loop diagram indeed in such depth. Perhaps before we turn to questions, I just would like to link this also back to the discussion we had in the previous webinar, which is really about the customization of integrated cost-benefit analysis, and for looking at infrastructure projects to assess those sustainability impacts. I think it's worthwhile noting that these CLDs that you have developed were also developed together with local stakeholders, validated with local stakeholders, as it's really important to integrate different parts of knowledge around these impacts into one comprehensive map, which then results in that complex CLD diagram. So I think that's just a point I would want to emphasize for our audience today, is that last week you did emphasize that point quite a bit, that customization, not only of the quantitative models, but also of these qualitative tools, which is quite critical. For the moment, I don't see questions popping up in the chat, but I do want to pause a few minutes to give people a chance to perhaps raise their hands. There's one question coming in into the Q&A, which is about the positive and negative signs under the loop. I think it's, maybe you can go back to the previous slides, Michael, that will help explaining that question. So do they refer to increase or decrease, or do they have different meanings? So if you can re-explain perhaps by the example of one loop, the plus and minuses signs.
Of course. So the plus and minus sign is not about reducing or increasing. It's about if a general dynamic goes towards one direction or not. So let's start with a loop here. Let's take the orange one. So let's say the demand for BRT transport increases the capacity of BRT transport, which reduces the use of individual transport modes. And then this, as a result, it can reduces fuel use. So in this case, since we are already reducing the use of individual transport modes, it's again a plus because the relationship is going on the same direction. So it reduces the use of individual transport modes, which further reduces fuel use, which further reduces CO2 emissions and air pollution. So here it's represented by a plus, but it is reducing them. So in a way, it is basically a dynamic that goes towards a certain direction. If this direction changes, then we include a different sign. So yeah, that's the explanation. Sometimes it's really counterintuitive, I guess, to understand that it can be increasing or reducing, but it's just about how it follows a certain dynamics towards the same direction. Lisbeth, I don't know if you have anything else to add, or if that it was clear.
I think that's right. It's really about the direction of the relation between the different impacts. So also see here on the slide, CO2 emissions and air pollution go, if that increases, basically health quality decreases, which is why it has a minus sign, because it's an inverse relationship. While the example that you gave there, Michael, use of individual transport modes, if that increases, congestion increases, which is why there's a plus sign. There's a directly related question, and now many of them are coming in, so that's excellent. So one related question, Michael, if you could clarify whether why does the use of the plus and minus signs matter? What do we do with that information?
So in this case, it's going to get a little bit more technical here. We include two different kind of loops. We have feedback loops where the change in the system is exponential, and we also have balancing loops where the change in the system reaches an equilibrium. What we try to achieve many times by looking at a causal loop diagram or at the system more generally is to kind of include as many positive feedback loops as possible. So positive effects or positive benefits can be exponential in the future. So in a way, the signs matter first when we build the causal loop diagram to understand how different dynamics or different impacts within a system work. So if one impact, as we saw, increases or reduces kind of the intensity of another impact. And once we understand that, it also helps us see at which points within that system it would be good to think about introducing an intervention. So when we can include an intervention within a positive feedback loop where positive change is exponential, then this is a positive approach because we understand at which point we should intervene, let's say, through a policy or a project and so on.
Thank you, Michael. There's two further questions which I'm going to bundle and probably ask if Andrea could come in on those, which is about the translation and the conversion of the causal loop diagram to the quantitative model into the example that's been given by the participant is Excel or other quantitative models. And perhaps you could also, in one go, address the question on the weight for each impact versus each other.
Yes, thank you, Lisbeth, and hello, everyone. So in fact, what we do as a next step after we have the causal diagram is to develop a model that can quantify these connections and generate forecasts for each of the indicators. There are two main methods to do this. The first one is called network analysis, and it focuses precisely on identifying a weight, so to the strength of the relationships. Normally, this is qualitative from 1 to 5. There is an indication of what is the strength of one relationship as opposed to another. And then the model is being simulated to see what are the factors that are impacted the most, again, with a scale from 1 to 5 in the whole system. We do not use this approach. Instead, we go on to quantify the indicators with specific units of measure. So if you have capacity of BRT transport, the variable at the center here, we would want to quantify it as number of buses, the size of buses, number of people that can be accommodated in these buses, and then the number of trips that are going to be taking place over the course of the day, the month, or the year with this specific infrastructure. So what we actually do is to turn these connections, the arrows that point to one or the other variable, into specific equations, meaning that the arrows that point to a variable become the argument of the equation. And so this is how we make so that from this more conceptual overview, we go on to develop forecasts, quantitative, that take into account the full complexity of the diagram. Given that we have data about the projects and we have data on the performance, like how it affects fuel use, for instance, depending on the number of passengers, how this affects emissions based on physics, based on the knowledge that we have on pollutants per unit of fuel use, say liter of gasoline or diesel and so on, we can skip that step of looking at the weights and formulate specific equations that describe these variables. I hope this helps. Happy to provide more information also in the chat and in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. I don't know, Michael, if there would be any additions on this question from your side.
No, I think everything was covered on this one.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
also, of course, in the next part of the webinar, dive into more detail on the quantitative model by means of zooming in on the BRT. So I'm hoping that will provide additional context for participants as well to see how that plays out, the translation of these indicators into the CBA model. There's another question on how you modeled the shift from individual transport modes to the BRT. And whether you model this as a base diffusion model. Maybe specifically on that one, I don't know, Michael, if you would want to come in first, or Andrea.
I can start, and then Michael, you can come in. So having data on the project, so having data on the potential size of the BRT expansion, we know the ridership. So we know the number of people that would use the bus in this specific case in a specific city context. And with that information, we can estimate the amount of avoided private vehicle use. And so this is how we inferred back the potential change in modal shares for different transport options. Then in certain cases, when we look at other projects, we have been given the information exactly to say, if you have these projects being introduced, then we have that impact that emerges, right? Changes in number of people that walk and cycle, number of people that use cars and buses, and so on and so forth. So it is mostly an input into our modeling exercise rather than an output based on how the project is introduced and when it is introduced. Sometimes when we do forward-looking assessments, we are asked to try and figure out what happens. And so based on introduction of a new, say, subway line, based on traffic patterns, the time lost in traffic, we will be able to try and forecast the ridership. But in this specific case, the ridership is an input directly into the model.
And just to add to that is that in this case, for our projects, sometimes we do have access to local data that is provided by the local or regional governments. Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated, and we need to do some secondary research or use some proxies. And for this particular project, we actually did have access to data. So these kind of shifts were partly provided to us. So different forecasts of how what would be the results of implementing the BRT, the city. Some of these shifts and forecasts were provided to us. So it was kind of more straightforward and easier for us to input this into our models. And then we can always add different scenarios, but at least we have a scenario that is based on forecast by the local government in this case.
Thank you. And I think that actually ties in nicely with the last set of questions, very interesting, that came in the chat, which is around the data collection. Michael, perhaps you can just share a few reflections on, for this case, but also for other assessments, how you go about data collection, a top-down or a bottom-up approach. And then very briefly, there's a question specifically on the BRT project, the infrastructure itself, whether you know whether this is permanently available 24/7. So that's just very briefly, and then we'll wrap this session up.
So just to answer the last question, to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure, but based on the data that we received, I think that it is not 24/7. Again, I'm not 100% sure. It's a good question. And to answer the other question about top-down or bottom-up approach, talking specifically about this project, we were lucky because we were able to have access to a lot of local data in Bandung about demand of different transport modes, forecast of shifts. We had access to some environmental data, for example, CO2 emissions, air pollution. So that was much easier for us to take that data that was already, let's say, customized to this local context or based on that local context and input that into our model. Other times it's not that easy. A lot of data is not available, especially when it comes to social and environmental data. So in that case, we try to find other solutions. We look at different cities or different countries that are similar size. We do some secondary research. We use other proxies. So the accuracy of the results is slightly lower, but in the absence of data, sometimes it is a necessary evil, let's say, that we have to apply. But in this case, it was really positive, and we did have access to a lot of different information about transport in Bandung.
Thank you so much, Michael and Andrea, for these responses, but also thanks a lot to participants for your questions on this part of the webinar. We will have another moment to get back to other questions or comments that you may have, so feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. But I'll now hand over to, I think, back to Michael and Eduardo for the second part of the presentation for the case study in Bandung in more depth.
Yeah, thank you, Lisbeth. Hello, everybody. My name is Eduardo. I'm a policy analyst at ISD. I will go through the example of the BRT in Bandung, taking the steps from the CLD, explaining a little bit of the context of the project and the results of the causal loop diagram, how these are used into our modeling, and the key indicators and results of this assessment. The next slide, please. So to provide a little bit of context, the BRT in Bandung is expected to improve access to transport, to reduce congestion, and to reduce energy cost and exposure to air pollution. This is for a city where private vehicles and especially motorcycles, they dominate. And the assessment will estimate the social, economic, and environmental benefits of the implementation of the project, and will assess also the contribution to the national net zero plan. Next one, please. The SAVI assessment in this project can provide important information on the environmental and social benefits of the BRT in the city. For example, the avoided emission as compared to the required reduction for reaching the net zero targets by 2060, but also avoided air pollution and health cost, and the value of time saved and job creation. What we do is to assess also the economic feasibility of the project, which involves a comprehensive evaluation considering the social savings and additional benefits, the societal savings and the additional benefits. And also our analysis will encompass the tangible and intangible economic aspects. This will provide an analysis also against the direct cost incurred by the municipality. Next slide, please. Which are our goals here for our assessment? So first of all, to assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the BRT, to quantify the added benefits and avoided cost and the direct cost of the project, but also to evaluate the economic and financial performance of the BRT system. Next one, thank you. So basically, we are assessing specific indicators, which we will see where they come from. But these indicators are the added benefits, avoided cost, and direct cost. In terms of added benefits, we identified revenues from the BRT use, also income creation from employment, benefits from physical activity, value of time saved, increase in retail revenue. And in terms of avoided cost, we have cost of air pollution, cost of CO2 emissions, cost of fuel, and cost of traffic accidents. And we also consider direct costs for the implementation of the project, which are capital cost and operation and maintenance cost. Next one. So this type of indicators are identified through the causal loop diagram that Michael had just explained before. And as it was also mentioned by Lisbeth, this process is a co-created consultation process with stakeholders. So through the causal loop diagram, we are able to identify and to integrate into our modeling these indicators. And this is generated through these synergies, causal relations, and impacts of the causal loop diagram. Next slide, please. Then what we do is to actually calculate added benefits and avoided costs. So we monetize these indicators, and the monetization of avoided costs and benefits depends a lot on data availability and also on the type of externalities that we analyze. For this type of for this process, we used market and non-market valuation methods. To give an example, like if we consider cost of fuel, which is also presented in this slide, we calculate the number of trips by transport per kilometers that are shifted to the BRT. We consider the total fuel consumption saved per kilometer traveled and the market price for liter of fuel. But there are also non-market valuation methods. These are techniques that are designed to capture the economic values of changes in terms of accessibility or quality of goods and services, which are typically not exchanged in the market. So think about healthcare or education. So the ultimate goal is to measure the effects of these changes on individual well-being and by extension to the societal welfare. So the idea is to allow to manage these goods and services by considering the true value to society. Next slide. So here you can see the first set of results of the integrated cost and benefits analysis. These data are cumulative, discounted over a lifetime of the project. And as you can see, they're divided between two scenarios. The first scenario is the current BRT scenario, which is based on passenger demand projections taken from the feasibility studies developed by GIZ in 2020. And then we have a high ambition scenario where there is a higher passenger demand projection, which double after 13 years of the BRT operation and triple after 23 years of the BRT operations. So as you can see already in terms of values, we have monetized and we have calculated the total benefits, the total added benefits, and the total avoided cost that are generated by the project, and these are then analyzed through specific indicators. For example, the benefits to cost ratio. But we will see this just after. Next slide, please. So here is to provide a better idea through this graph of the magnitude of this avoided cost and benefits. And as you can see, the biggest value generated is through time saved, followed by retail revenues, and which are the main avoided cost and benefits generated by the project. And also we can see that BRT system will have a significant economic benefits related to these aspects, but also as well with health benefits generated by the increased physical activity and reduced level of air pollution. Next slide. And in this slide, we can see how actually for a BRT project, the investment costs are just from a traditional analysis point of view. The investment costs are only a small, is just a tip of the iceberg. The survey can quantify and can look at the economic benefits, the social benefits, and environmental benefits, which generate a large value from economic point of view, and they provide they generate benefits for the societal as a whole. Next slide, please. So we can say that the benefits of the BRT are significantly higher when the valued added benefits and avoided costs are integrated into the cost and benefits analysis for both scenarios, so for the current scenario and the high ambition scenario. As we can see, in terms of results, we have the cost to benefits ratio, which is this ratio to understand the worthiness of the project, and we can see that if we consider the typical benefits to cost ratio, which includes the traditional benefits to cost ratio, which includes investment costs, revenues from the BRT, and income creation from employment and other costs of fuel use, we generate between 0.27 and 0.28 of BCR. But if we consider the sustainable benefits to cost ratio, which actually integrates the full range of economic, social, and environmental added benefits, so all the indicators that we saw before, these values are much higher. So the BCR are much higher for both, for the current BRT scenario and the high ambition BRT scenario. Next one. So to conclude, the Savvy assessments provides evidence that actually investing in this BRT project is a worthwhile investment, and it generates environmental, social, and economic benefits, including the avoided cost for the project. Also, we can say that through our Savvy methodology, we can actually make a stronger case for the BRT system, and we are able to see that actually the project gives more access to job markets, that provide more benefits to citizens, and improves the overall quality of life for the citizens. In terms of benefits that we see, it's also in terms of economic benefits, such as increased government revenues and also employment creation. This provides also improvement of traffic congestion and transport efficiency. We see that there is an increase in health benefits and a decrease in the fatality events, and it also reduces emissions. So the key lesson here is that when we account for multiple environmental, social, and economic benefits of the sustainable infrastructure projects, the economic viability of these projects is actually higher, and the value for money is actually maximized. And also, it's important to consider that these results are also important to be integrated in the financial analysis and to see actually the project can be financed also based on these indicators that we just see before. And next slide, and I pass the floor back to Michael, or if you have any question, please feel free to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for this case study. Really interesting. Thank you. So please, if you have any questions about how we calculated some of these, I already saw some questions in the chat, which we can visit soon.
There was a couple of questions popping in around the which air pollution was valued and how we calculated the cost of CO2 emissions. So Michael or Eduardo, if you could go back to the slide on the valuation methods. Yes, that's the one. Perhaps I could ask you to come in on some reflections. I'm just going to read the questions out loud. So what air pollution was used in the model? How was the CO2 emission cost calculated? And perhaps also look at whether you included shifts from traditional public transport to the BRT. And again, like how you looked at that. And then there's another question to which I'll come back to.
Thank you. So just to answer your question, first about air pollution, we did use different two different particulate matter, so the 2.5 and 1. Then we used the NOx and I think one more. So we kind of use different pollutants and how each transport modes, to what extent these transport modes actually are responsible for these different pollutants. When it comes to CO2 emissions, we basically use, I think here this is a typo, this is actually the CO2 emissions. We use the social cost of carbon based on secondary research on Nordhaus, which in this case, I think it's $30 per ton of CO2. Similarly to other impacts, we look at the different difference in emissions between the business as usual scenario and in this case the BRT, and then we looked at the emission factors by transport modes. From motorcycle, we consider motorcycle, four-wheeler cars, buses, and also to answer that question, we also included ANCOTs because we received data about ANGOTs and some of the informal sector transport modes. So we did include that in the data. And when we do have these emissions factors, we at the end, we multiply it by the social cost of carbon, which, as I said, is $30 per ton.
Thank you. I think there's a question that's tied in with the CO2 cost calculation, which is related to the tool that has been used for the CO2 accounting, which actually refers more to the biophysical impacts, or perhaps the data, Michael, that you used for the overall CO2 emissions related to the different transport modes. If you could shed some light on that, that would be helpful.
I think for this answer, maybe Andrea could help. It's part of the modeling, and I think for every case study, it's slightly different.
Yes, and this is, Michael, for the air pollution and the CO2 or something else?
I think it's in this case it's about the CO2 and how we developed the tool for accounting for the CO2 in this case.
Yeah, so it's based directly on the amount of fossil fuels that are consumed. So it is a direct conversion from energy to the tons of CO2. And we do the same for other air pollutants, several air pollutants that we track. So the primary input for the calculation is really the energy that is consumed. Then, like we discussed in the other webinar, we look at the exposure to air pollution that comes from the energy use and the emissions that come from other sources. But in this case, for the avoided CO2, it's a direct change in the energy use, which overall is lower when we have the BRT, because on a per passenger basis, the bus would generate less emissions per passenger kilometer.
Thank you. Another question that came in and relates to the kind of different transport modes and shift is whether in this exercise and in the model, whether you considered the transport mode that was used for the first and last mile, as we're talking about the public transit system. So I don't know, Michael or Andrea or Eduardo, if you want to comment on that one.
I can respond quickly that we are not looking at, let's say, if someone wants to take a bus, instead of taking the car, if they have to drive a little bit longer to get to the bus station and then get on the bus. We are considering the amount of kilometers that the bus will travel and therefore the avoided distance in a way for a single passenger. We do take into account, though, that the average distance for a passenger that takes the bus may be a bit longer than the most direct route that would be taken with a car. So that we consider. But we don't take into account that, you know, the bus stop is 2 kilometers away, and so I would need to drive 2 kilometers more to get to the bus station, or when I get to my destination, the bus stop, on arrival, I need to get a taxi to go to my workplace. That initial part and final part we don't consider.
Thank you, Andrea. Then there's a next question, also related to what is included in the model or what might not be, which is Yassine's question on are higher abstract conditions like population growth and debt included in the models, or if not in this case, how? Because I know that's questions that you've all been thinking about how that might be included in the model. I don't know, Michael, if you want to go first, and then Andrea.
Yeah, happy to answer that. So we do consider population growth in our models over time. And this is throughout all our models. This is something that we definitely consider. And debt, we do consider for the assessments that we also include a sustainable finance model, where we actually look at how these projects are financed over time by debt or equity or so on. So this goes to a kind of like a parallel assessment about the same project. Once we include that, for example, for this project, we did include a sustainable finance model. So we did include it. Not sure if Andrea, you have anything to add.
Or maybe Eduardo, if you want to share a reflection on that as well in relation to how the projects may be financed or not. I don't know if you want to come in on that point.
Yes. So in terms of how the project can be financed, what we generally do, we assess the general economic and financial indicators from the net present value, the BCR that we just see, and also the internal rate of return. That's the first step in terms of what we want to assess from a financial analysis, by integrating all these benefits and avoided cost into these indicators. After that, we see how the project can be financed in terms of looking at possible solutions in terms of a loan or a grant or a mix of both. And we can see, and we try to structure the financing component also in relation to these economic benefits, environmental and avoided cost and added benefits, looking specifically in this case to the tangible benefits, which are mostly more indicative, they provide more information when we look at the financing component. Hope this provides enough an explanation.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. A couple of other questions coming into the chat, and I would also want to encourage others to just let us know if you have follow-up questions on these comments and responses. There is one going back to the approach and the tools used for the calculation of emissions. Andrea, I believe you want to come in on that one. So what tools are being used? One tool that's mentioned is LEAP. So I don't know if you want to share some reflections on that.
Yes. First of all, thank you for following up. We know LEAP very well. I've used it for about a decade in supporting different governments in figuring out low carbon pathways or green economy, green growth type of scenarios, together with other types of models. And in short, we don't use a tool for the emission accounting. We basically look at using the equations that LEAP also uses, or a model like TIMES, Markal, or the green economy model actually use to do our own calculations. So in LEAP, as I understand, in most cases, we look at the energy flows within the energy balance, and then there are coefficients that link the energy use to the different types of air pollutants and CO2 emissions. So we basically do the same in our models. We review the UNFCCC guidance on the creation of greenhouse gas inventories. We see what is the carbon intensity of different fuels with different grades. We see what type of fuels will be used in the country, in this case, Indonesia, for this type of buses. And then we use the right coefficient to make sure that we have, based on the energy consumption, which is driven by energy efficiency for the type of engine and weight of the vehicle and so on and so forth, the amount of emissions that will be generated. So we don't use any specific tool for the emission accounting, but we use the same equations that are used by the tools like LEAP that you mentioned. We do a bottom-up assessment in that we adjust the analysis to the type of fuels and the grade of fuels and so on that are being used in the country specifically. So I hope these answer the question and removes the concerns.
And I get the note in the chat that it's all clear. So thank you very much. I want to pick up one follow-up question, and I'll come back to about the question about availability of the models and materials later towards the end of the webinar. But there's a follow-up question from Yassine on whether we've ever encountered an initiative or I'm assuming in an assessment of a project where the outcomes suggested no cost benefit, or if I'm going to make a guess, Yassine, what you're asking is whether there might potentially be no benefit of a project once incorporating these impacts. I hope I get that right. Maybe Andrea, to share some reflections on that, on how outcomes may have looked in other projects.
Yes, it has happened quite often, and I will explain how, meaning that the project is not economically or financially viable. That is what we see, that the investment is not paid back, and so the benefit to cost ratio is not above 1, or the internal rate of return is below the inflation or the target discounting rate that we use. But it also depends on the methodology. What we find in the vast majority of cases is that we may see that from a financial point of view, the project is not bankable, it's not viable. But when we add the economic valuation of the externalities, then it becomes economically viable. So there is that difference between the financial viability and the economic viability. This is the same approach that is being used by the Green Climate Fund, for instance, and they want to see the two separate assessments, the economic and the financial one. We do notice, though, that in the vast majority of cases, from an economic perspective, so an integrated perspective, looking at the societal value, the projects are economically beneficial. Then there is another question to ask, and that is whether this is more beneficial, it generates more value than other potential projects. And so we always need to look at what is the starting point and what is the main goal. If the goal is to trigger more economic growth, we may prioritize certain projects. If the goal is to reduce exposure to climate change with adaptation or to air pollution, then we may go for other types of projects. It all depends on what is the underlying metric being used to assess the performance. But we have encountered cases in which projects are not financially viable, and in the vast majority of cases, they are viable when we add the economic valuation of the externalities.
Thank you, Andrea, for that, and also thank you for the question. I don't see any other pressing questions popping up, so I'll just take a few moments to answer to Elliot's question on how others can access the materials around the SAFI methodology and whether this can be operationalized, whether you yourself can use these tools. The answer to that is absolutely yes. You may have heard in Michael's previous presentation last week that for the development of the system dynamics models, our team uses a software which is called Vensim. There's a free version of this software available, and that's the software that's being used for drawing the causal loop diagrams, as well as translating that into the quantitative models. For the Excel-based models, the software is slightly more accessible, and a lot of the models that we're creating are available for use. They're being posted on our website. Don't know if there we go. My colleague has already posted the material, the links to where you can find some of these materials. I do want to emphasize that a lot of the projects we've been working on together with stakeholders, we're customizing the models to one specific project. So it's really important, and this is where part of the capacity building material and the training also comes in. We think it's critical to customize these models to specific projects, but that can perfectly be done by different stakeholders, other civil society organizations, the private sector, departments within the public sector that are working on making the case for more investment into sustainable projects. But we're definitely trying to offer as much material as possible. We're also documenting the results of the specific projects we've been working on in different sectors, be it in transport, energy sector, the water sector, etc., into in-depth technical reports where we're documenting how, for example, was the valuation method used for a specific indicator, but also what were the data and what are the assumptions behind the model. So we're trying to make as much of that material available, and should there be material that you're not able to find and that you're interested in, please do reach out to us, and really happy to take up that conversation. In the meantime, there was a question coming in from Philippe on the general response during to the models during protesting. I'm not entirely sure what the protesting refers to. Or Philippe, if you would like to come in and provide more context to your question. But otherwise, I would just share this with the team for some general reflections on responses to these modeling exercises. Maybe Michael or Andrea, you could just share maybe from another example on how the results of the models have been used and what they generated during the modeling process. If there's any feedback you could share.
Yes, I can start providing some general information. Then Michael, you may want to go deeper. But one example also related to transport was a project done with the government of Queensland, where they implemented a betterment project for improving climate resilience of roads. So trying to argue that there is value in investing in improving roads before damage strikes because of extreme events, or in reconstructing and rebuilding, it's better to build climate resilient because it will avoid costs in the future. So in this case, they engaged with us to develop a model that takes into account all the additional social, economic, and environmental impacts that are more secondary, indirect and induced impacts, because they had statistics on the cost of the project, and they had tracked the number of events after the work was performed, so doing road work to improve the road network, to see how many extreme events were avoided. But they didn't know what was the value to society. And so reaching the end of the project, having to argue for continuation of funding and continuation of the project, they felt the need to have this information on the social benefits and environmental benefits. And so that's how we then developed a model with them, but was actually a template model validated for a few specific projects that then they could apply to the new proposals, new projects to be implemented in the next couple of years, again, to make the case for the investment. So this is just one example on how the model can be used to support planning going forward for projects related to sustainability. There are many others that are more project specific, like the one we have shown now, where we may contribute to an improved design, meaning that if you figure out that there is a specific externality like carbon or air pollution is very important, then maybe there is policy introduced to make it internal, not consider it an external factor anymore. And that would improve the financial performance, because we move one indicator from an economic side only, we move it back into the financial analysis. And so we improve the bottom line and the performance of the project. So it really depends on the type of assessment we perform and the local context, but we see value both at the beginning of the process for formulating the idea, all the way to the end, having the experience of something that has been done to possibly continue that effort in the next few years with new projects. So it's a bit of a mix, and in my view, that's what makes it interesting, actually.
Thank you. And I hope, Philippe, that that also gives that also provides an answer to your question. Otherwise, don't hesitate to provide the context. Okay, good. Thank you. Great. That actually, I think, concludes the Q&A. And I would just want to take a minute before closing to introduce you to the topic of the third webinar as part of the Sustainable Transport series, which will be taking place already on Thursday, day after tomorrow, but on a different time, because we will be introducing you to work that was done on a mass rapid transit project in Bogota, Colombia, and would really want to make sure that colleagues from Colombia can, of course, join us for that discussion. But as always, should you be based in a time zone where you can't join us on Thursday, we'll be sharing the recording with you afterwards. And on that session, we'll be diving into more detail into that case study, and also share the reflections on how the results of the system dynamics models create that integrated cost-benefit analysis, as well as how do project finance models integrate the externalities of these infrastructure projects. And we'll do that by means of the example in Bogota. So that's what we'll be looking at on Thursday. And then last but not least, and my colleague has just dropped you the link for a 2-minute survey. I would say it's even a minute and a half if you're fast into providing us some responses. We really would like to hear from you, get your feedback on these webinars. It's really important for us to be able to improve our work moving forward into the next year on sustainable transport and on sharing knowledge and engaging in a discussion with you on economic and financial analysis of transport projects. So please take a moment. I think it's also on the last slide. You have a QR code. If you have your phone in the hand, we'll be able to share with you. I'm not sure, Michael, if you can jump to the next slide. So you can fill out the survey there. And then we really look forward to seeing you back on Thursday for a last webinar on sustainable transport with our team. I would really like to thank the team for being here today, for presenting and for answering the questions, engaging in the discussion. And of course, really want to thank you all for participating in this webinar. If there's any questions that you have afterwards, I think Michael's listed on the last slide as contact person. Don't hesitate to reach out and send us a message and provide us your feedback in the survey. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Looking forward to Thursday's session and looking forward to hearing more from you. Wishing you all a very good rest of the day. Thank you so much.